This is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by Young Harris College and the Richard Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Our guest today is Bob Holmes, former state legislator, political activist, and a professor in an Atlanta college. Bob, we're delighted to have you.
Glad to be here, Bob.
Tell us about Bob Holmes.
Well, I was born in a little town in West Virginia. I actually was outside the city limits. In 1943, town of Shepherdstown, West Virginia, had 800 people, but I'm sure that included the dogs and cats and other animals, because I don't think there were 800 people there. But I went to school there, elementary school there. My father left when I was 3, and my brother was 5, and my mom went to New York to become a hotel maid with my oldest aunt. And so we got started working pretty early. I was 9 years old, and we picked cherries for 37.5 cents a 2.5-gallon bucket. We thinned peaches. You know, they grow in little clusters, so you knock off the big, little smaller ones, and the bigger ones grow. And we got 50 cents an hour and 10 cents a tree. And then we picked peaches. We got 50 cents an hour and 5 cents for a bale. And we thinned peaches and then apples, same thing. But then we hauled hay for 50 cents an hour and a penny a bale. And here I am, 14 years old. We're making, you know, basically about $10 a day max. But we work 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. Mm-hmm. So school was really vacation to me. Mm-hmm. You know, just reverse. But a little later, we moved to New York. Had a chance to live with my mom when she was able to get a rent-controlled apartment. 5 years later, we lived with my grandmom and my aunt in West Virginia, and I was a juvenile delinquent. I got drunk the first time in my life when I was 11. My best friend overdosed on heroin when I was 14, so my mother shipped us back to West Virginia, where I finished high school. Went to a little college there, Shepherd College. And then I grew up. I studied very hard. I got graduate fellowships for a lot of universities. I decided to go to Columbia University, where I got my master's and doctorate, and I finished my doctorate when I was 25. And then I began teaching. And then I stayed in New York. I was an administrator at City University of New York, and one of my mentors there was a guy named Robert Weaver, who was the first African-American secretary in the cabinet, Secretary of HUD, and he took a liking to me. And when I was in graduate school, he was on one of the panels where I got another fellowship, the John A. Whitney Foundation. And so he said he had something that I might be interested in. After he left HUD, became president of the City University of New York, Bernard Baruch College, which was basically a school of business. And I decided I wanted to leave the city. I'd never been at a historically black college university, so I decided I wanted to go there. So I went down to Baton Rouge, Louisiana at Southern University and taught there under a special program from Woodrow Wilson Foundation, where I was like an assistant to the president. I helped reorganize their honors program. I helped set up what was called the General Electric College Bowl thing, which was great because it focused on academics, and everyone knew who the football players were, but no one knew who the bright kids were. So we set this up, and as I was leaving, it was a one-year appointment. We were playing the University of Southwest Louisiana, Grambling College, and places like that. And it was really fun. And I went back to New York because Dr. Weaver called me, flew me back twice, and I directed a program there called SEEK, Search for Elevation, Education, and Knowledge. And for kids who otherwise wouldn't have been admitted to the good four-year institutions like Baruch, like CCNY and Brooklyn College, they would have mostly went to, so we were to mainstream them. And that was really a fun thing that I did, and I really enjoyed it. I had 1,100 students. It was like running a small college. I also ran a program called the Harvard, Yale, Columbia Intensive Summer Studies program, involving students from the South who, if they did very well, would be admitted to those institutions, and they would also, we'd give them fellowships. And then the South came calling, and a friend of mine was the director of programs, social sciences at Ford Foundation, and he got $25 million to help set up a doctoral program at Atlanta University in political science. Only one other historically black college had a PhD program in political science, and so I decided I wanted to come and help with that activity, and that's how I get involved there. And then I became very active in the community, helped found my neighborhood association, helped, you know, well, I was president of the PTA and things like that, helped form the Citywide League of Neighborhoods. Became involved in Andy Young's election in 1972. Got to meet Andy, helped write speeches for him and things like that in the campaign. Then in '73, did some of the same things for Maynard Jackson, and I ran in '74, and I was in fact elected. I've also gotten involved in several business ventures. One of the co-founders of a couple of banks. One is the North Georgia National Bank, which we sold. It's called the Bank of North Georgia now. Capital City Bank, which is an African-American owned bank. We have 7 branches. We just got into the top 10 this past year. And then I also had a couple of other, ventures. I owned a computer dealership, and I was a real estate broker, and kind of combined the academic life because it was a PhD program, and really I didn't have to spend a lot of time there, maybe 15 to 20 hours a week being an advisor, teaching 2 graduate courses and doing research. And then I decided, well, I had been an advisor and people began to encourage me to run for the legislature, and I did, and I was fortunate enough to win in 1974 and took office in 75. While I was in the legislature, there were several people that I really admired. Mr. J.C. Daugherty, who was elected back in, I think, 66 or something like that. And Ms. Grace Hamilton, of course, who was the first African-American female ever elected. She really taught me a lot, about politics and how to build coalitions and things of that nature. And interesting enough, another guy who was elected not too long before me, Billy McKinney. This is a guy, if you talk about someone who stood on principles, he was there for 20-some years. He never made a committee chair because he was, I guess I hate to use this word, a maverick. He sued the state on several occasions involving, equal opportunity kinds of programs. He was involved in a lawsuit suing about judges who were being elected, Superior Court judges from districts and things of that nature. And I said, this guy reminded me a lot of my grandma. She said, it didn't matter if you were the only one, Bobby. She died when she was 98. You always do what is the right thing because God's watching you, and everyone is going to be accountable at some time. And I like to think that I emulated her teachings, and also that Billy kind of reinforced, and I really didn't regret a lot of things, I guess, that I did, decisions that I had to make in the legislature. Well, my interest in the legislature not only came from being involved as a side of a consultant or a volunteer, or a combination thereof, but it was also because my field was political science and public policy. And as I said, I came here to help set up the doctoral program in political science in 1971, and that was really exciting because there were only 2 people in the department who were over 40. All of us in our 30s, and we had been out of grad school 4, 5, 6 years, and had a chance to build something from scratch. And we graduated more African-American PhDs in political science between 1975 and 2000 than any other university in the country. And the great thing about it was that, I call them kids, but some of them were my age because they had been teaching in college and came back to get their doctors. But they were outstanding students. One of my students became director of the graduate program at Yale University. Another became, 3 of them became college presidents. Johnson C. Smith, University of Mississippi Valley State, University, and a branch of well, it was a small college, a junior college in Mississippi. They became mayors, they became elected officials. In Virginia, one young lady was not only the mayor of Hampton, she was a dean at Hampton University, and she's now a senator and still a dean at Hampton University. So to see those kids do the kind of things they did, and they were really good. They had choices. They could have gone to some Ivy League schools and things of that nature, but they decided they wanted to have that experience, and I think we made it exciting and fun for them, and I encouraged them, and they went on to do a lot of great things.
You mentioned Grace Hamilton,
yes,
who was one of the first African-American legislators,
yes,
and
female,
probably the first female.
All female ever, yes.
She passed a bill that created districts in the city. I think it was in
City charter.
City charter. That really changed politics in Atlanta, didn't it?
Well, it basically did. The thing I admired her at first went back to when I was 5 years old. I wasn't here, but when the white primary was declared unconstitutional, and the mayor, Hartsfield, was running for re-election. He basically told the elected, he told people, this is back in the 40s, of course, he told them, said, look, you need to get some folk registered to vote, and I'll negotiate with you about some things that you want. I mean, street lights, hiring the first African-American policeman, and things of that nature. Billy McKinney was among that group. You know, building parks and neighborhoods, and that's what she did. She was the director of the Urban League when she was elected. But the city charter was something where she sought to bring about, I guess, a compromise, because it had been elected at large. And as you probably know, when you have a situation, and given the racial polarization, even in the city of Atlanta, you didn't have any African Americans elected. And she thought it was swinging in the opposite direction, or it might. And that her big thing was people needed to have not only concerns about their little districts, but they also need to have concern about at-large. So she basically said, we'll have a mixture of at-large and some from districts. And it was 12 districts and 6 at-large to give the citywide perspective, and that would create a kind of balance that would be necessary for the best, you know, things, best public policy to be adopted in the city. She was a very interesting lady. We had some disagreements, like I did with a lot of people, but I have disagreements with my mom and my brother. But no, that was by, and the new charter did another thing. It created a strong mayor form of government. Now, people know that Hartsfield and Allen were very strong mayors, but it was like saying Richard Daley was a strong mayor because Chicago had a weak mayor form of government. And what I meant was that the city council actually ran the administration. The chairman of the Public Safety Committee ran the police department and the fire department. You know, the chairman of Parks and Recreation ran the parks. They basically told the commissioners what to do. And that was the difference, but this made it clear that you're going to have a separation. The mayor was going to be the administrator. The council wasn't going to be the administrator and legislative body. They were going to be the legislative bodies and make policies, and then the courts, of course, would remain as they were.
As I recall, the results of that election was 9 whites and 9 African Americans on that first council.
No, that actually happened in the second election, 1977. Yeah. But it got that way. It was moving that direction. When Maynard was elected, there was a great debate between whether they wanted to support another gentleman, Senator Horace Tate, to run for mayor as well. And so when he was running for a city council, for vice mayor, Maynard 4 years earlier, you only had one person, Q.V. Williamson. 65 was the only African American on the account, and they elected 4 more, and they elected, I think, 2 additional ones then, and in '77, because one of the mayor's advisors, David Franklin, was saying, well, look, you need to have a slate because you need to make sure that you have 12 or 13 African Americans, and Maynard said no. And so at that election in '77, you did have 9-9. And of course, Carl Ware was elected president of the council. He could break the vote, but most of the votes weren't just based on racial lines. I think because of the mix of the at-large and district, that many people decided to vote for what might be considered district types of things, regardless of the racial, breakdown in terms of the vote. So I think it did create that good balance that you need in a city that's as diverse, as the city of Atlanta is.
Let's get back to State Representative Bob Holmes.
Okay.
You came over to the Capitol in 1975.
That's right.
What was going on back then?
Well, a lot of things. As you probably know, the speakers was becoming more independent of the governor. Up until what, 72 or something like that, I guess. Speaker Smith was the first one who was independent. The governors before then actually used to appoint basically the committee chairs and everything. They told the speaker what to do and who to do this. And when he started that, and then of course Speaker Murphy, who succeeded him, was beginning to say, well, we have to show that we're a co-equal branch of government. So you had this same thing that had happened at the city, where the mayor was being given greater authority, the speaker was given greater authority. You had a lot of new people. My class is the largest in history. We had 67 members in the class of 1975. And the reason that it happened was the fact that the people who were there before us, that a lot of them voted for a retroactive pay raise for themselves. They were elected in 1972, and in January, early February, they gave themselves a retroactive pay raise. And I said they ought to be unelected or defeated for stupidity. And I said I wouldn't say I wouldn't vote for a pay raise, but I'd never vote for one that would be made retroactive, that is after. But if the new term came up and I were reelected, certainly I would accept that, because it was clear that this was a part-time job, but you work at it year-round. You go to neighborhood meetings, you go to all kinds of things, hearings and stuff of that nature. But that was what was happening. And so many of us freshmen were going in as quote-unquote reformers. We were going to make our voices heard. We were young, we were excited about what we were getting into, and we determined that we were going to negotiate with the speaker and make sure that he adhered to some of our concerns. Well, and we even met in caucus outside of the Capitol. We met at a hotel near the airport, you know, and I guess about, probably close to 60 of them actually showed up. Well, unfortunately, the speaker heard about it before the meeting even ended. And so you know what happened after that. Some of us who were considered the ringleaders, we didn't fare too well in terms of committee appointments. You know, coming up, he must have gotten just a detailed list of who was doing this and who was doing that from 4 or 5 folks. And we pretty much could guess who those people were who reported to him based on the committee assignments that they got. You know, they got the good committee assignments. Well, that didn't basically stop me. Unfortunately, because that happened, it kind of almost reinforced me. And people said, "Are you crazy?" Al Burris decided that he wanted to run for speaker, and Al was going to promise both the freshman biracial group as well as the Atlanta delegation, and to do it based more on seniority and the diversity and the fact that we were the largest. So from 2 perspectives, because I had sat down and talked to the speaker, that's one of the things my grandmom also taught me. You never talk about people behind their back, say things you won't say to their face. So I said, "Mr. Speaker, I'm kind of disappointed that you have this budget committee, so-called Green Door Committee. There's no member from Fulton County who's on it, and we're the largest delegation. And you got a few folks, you've got Sidney and you got Jerry, you know, to be, you know, on the, you know, they've got enough seniority, or at least they should represent Fulton County, because when you're dividing up this budget, and you've got folk from South Georgia and North Georgia and whatever, Atlanta Metro, you know, Bill Lee," I said, "You know, they're great people, but you need to either expand it or you need to make more people involved." And then I said, you know, and even committee assignments, I said, you know, he was appointing Sidney to them. That Sidney was chairman of health, and Jerry was Jerry Horton.
Sidney
was
Marcus
chairman. Yeah, Sidney.
I'm
using it first. I'm sorry. Yeah, Sidney Marcus, and he was chairman of the delegation as well.
Yeah.
And Jerry was Horton was chair of industry, but I like those committees. They're not among the most powerful committees, but I think you got Mr. Daugherty, and certainly he has enough seniority. He'd been here, what, I don't know, 10, 12 years to be chairman of a committee, and, you know, people like that. And Papa Dent, you know, he did appoint Papa Dent, something like Human Relations and Aging, but I said, those aren't very important, you know, committees. And so I said, there's someone running who is willing to do that. And so you had both the Atlanta delegation, urban, and you had the lack of African Americans on, you know, important committees and things of that nature. And I told him, I said, well, I'm going to have to support Representative Burris. And why did I do that? So I said to myself, 6 years later, when I still hadn't got a good committee assignment or anything, he must really be a closet Republican. He's an elephant. He never forgets things that happen. So, so what happened was that Al, of course, lost. 2 years later, when my chairman resigned of a committee that's called State of Republic, it's called Governmental Affairs, and I was the vice chair. But instead of me becoming chair, he got someone who didn't even serve on the committee and appointed him chairman of the committee. And he didn't want to be chairman of the committee as well. So I didn't fare very well my first decade in the legislature because I had done those things first, saying we're going to pressure him to do certain things, and then we're going to have a speaker who was going to be more diverse in terms of his appointments, getting African Americans, getting Fulton County folks and things of that nature on important committees, more importantly on the budget committee. And then things began to settle down. I did become active in the Legislative Black Caucus. I eventually became chair, but what happened was that the caucus began pushing things that some of us who were ahead of our times, I would like to say, were pushing, like having African American on the budget subcommittee as well. And what happened was that Calvin Smyre was the governor's floor leader. So he couldn't appoint him, Governor Joe Frank Harris.
Right.
Well, David Lucas was thought to be more, quote unquote, uncontrollable than I was. David was younger than I was, but he was as loud and everything. And so by default, I became the first African American on the budget subcommittee. And of course, that meant that folk were coming to me, not only from Atlanta, but from all over the state, African Americans, the HBCU, colleges and universities and things of that nature. So that it did work out in the long run, which was, again, something my grandmother always told me. It's like when you pray. She said, the Lord will eventually answer your prayers, but he'll do it on his time. So I thought that was something of a test. I had to say, my grandmother was the wisest human being I'd ever known. She never set foot inside of a school. She was born during Reconstruction. But anyway, my mom is the second youngest of 13. But, and then I guess I learned a lot. He also appointed me chairman of the Governmental Affairs Committee. Of course, I got on Appropriations Committee, and I also got on the Rules Committee eventually. And I had seniority because Calvin and David and I were the ones who came in together. There were a few other folks, but they had left or done other things, like David Scott went to the Senate and things of that nature. But I think I began to learn some things, and I almost felt like was in school again, and I needed to learn as much as I could, but also being specialized. And I became director of an organization called the Southern Center for Studies in Public Policy, which was really a great thing because we did research, or my staff did, and I did, on issue areas that affected the state. They were environment. So I got interested and learned a lot about environmental justice. We dealt with education. We dealt with almost all of the major public policy issues. So while I was learning about legislation, I was getting a lot of background from research that we did, and we did work for different governments. We did work for the private sector, and even did a lot of work internationally in Mongolia, in Nigeria, in China, and some other places. We evaluated, for example, the revival of their higher education system in China. Believe it or not, we helped to set up a school of public administration in Mongolia, which had been a Communist Party school, and just had all kinds of great experiences. In Nigeria, we helped with legislators because if the military would leave, then the people who were elected were all freshmen, because the military decreed that if you served in the previous civilian administration, you were ineligible to serve in another one. So here we had school teachers and farmers. They knew nothing about legislatures. So we were in 8 states training legislators how to be legislators. And it was just a great experience. And I learned from them, and I learned a lot, and those kinds of things. So I was learning about public policy, and then I, of course, decided that I wanted to focus on things. And election law reform was my primary thing, and that's what Governmental Affairs did. We were also oversight for the state merit system and a few other things. So I became particularly interested in that, and I was one of the folks who sponsored the motor voter legislation, which the feds were, of course, pushing. I also, my first bill, this was even before, I sponsored a bill which allowed retirees 62 years of age to be able to attend any branch of the University System of Georgia for free on a space available basis. And we couldn't advertise it because the university system schools would be inundated. And I've talked to several folks, and when I said, well, I actually managed to do that in '76. But, and it's worked. I just talked to a guy at the YMCA I work out with from time to time, and he says, I'm going back to school, Bob. I said, well, where are you going? He said, Georgia State, and he said, it's free. I said, I'll tell you why. And so I am blessed, but I did these things not because of, but it was something I was interested in. I always thought that, life is a learning experience, and there are people who, for different reasons, didn't get an opportunity to go. And this was an opportunity for them to go and do some things to keep their mind sharp and to also learn and even maybe go into a second career after that. But back to the legislature and Speaker Murphy, we then kind of, I guess, came together afterwards. I'm not sure he ever forgot, because there were things on the budget subcommittee which I thought he may have opposed because I was supporting them, but maybe I was being paranoid or something like that. But I think Speaker Murphy was an outstanding leader. People say that he was only interested in rural things, but the Georgia World Congress Center wouldn't have been built. You know, the Dome wouldn't have been built. MARTA wouldn't have been pushed as far, although I think obviously there were problems with MARTA, the fact that the state was putting their members on the body, but they would not commit for line item annual appropriations, and we're still the only major transit system in any state in the nation that doesn't have a line item in the state budget for us. But you know, that was something that I'm sure a lot of the rural folks supported, because you can build an awful lot of miles of roads in rural areas rather than giving to mass transit, but it has its long-term effect, and ultimately it affects them out there. But I understand as a legislature, you got to bring home the bacon, and you can go out and cut the ribbon on the highway and say we got a 10-mile, 4 lanes now instead of 2 lanes. I understand you have to do that. But I think he did an awful lot of things, you know, in education as well. I just think he was just a great leader. And like a lot of people, he had his ways of doing things. I would guess that, as I said, the legislation that I was primarily interested in, as I said, not only was education, but also the election law reform, and there were just maybe 2 or 3 other things that I thought I started getting more into the environment, and then I did get on the Natural Resources and Environment Committee. It was my first choice, but when the new speaker in the legislature was majority of the Republicans, and they of course kicked me off of my committees, which I thought was unique in the United States. Usually you become what the ranking member, you're the senior member of the other party, but no, you're off of education, you're off of appropriation, you're off of rules. And I was the second most senior person in the entire legislature, tied with Calvin now. You know, only Speaker Coleman had more years than I did, and I think there was one other legislature.
You were there how many years?
34.
34 years.
34 years, yep.
And a very busy man.
Well, yeah, well, you know, the grandmother's thing, the idle mind, this devil's workshop, and I always thought that since I was so bad, literally, as a youngster, I tried to go close to the other extreme, and I know that by doing things constantly, like I mentioned, I was involved in outside businesses and did a lot of other things, did a lot of consulting work in addition to that, and spent a lot of time with my 3 children. You know, I was the kind of a soccer mom. I don't want to get into that, but I took them to swimming lessons, to dancing lessons, to piano lessons. I never missed a swim meet. I never missed a track meet of my girls, and that was just the way I knew. And I knew in large part was because my father left when I was 3.
You remember, you mentioned Mayor Hartsfield encouraging voter registration.
Well, it was for a selfish purpose. He wanted to get reelected. And if you looked at the mayoral races, there was pretty much a division down the middle. The white voters almost split equally. And a lot of times his challengers actually had more white votes than he did. That's the reason he wanted more African Americans, because he was more liberal than the folks who were running against him. And so he felt if you got more, then I have to give you something in exchange. I mean, that was a fair trade as far as everything.
VEP, the Voter Education Project.
Yeah.
I recall that Congressman Lewis was once involved. Lyndon Wade was once involved.
Yeah.
Tell us about that project and its success.
Well, as you know, the registration rate of African Americans in the South was, in Mississippi, I think it was like 7% when the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And one of the things that a lot of black leaders were interested in was saying that, you know, here were people who were living in rural areas, you know, on plantations and things of this nature, and as sharecroppers. They knew nothing about it. And one of my, I had to say, my idol's mentor was a gentleman named Clarence Baycoat. Professor Baycoat was the first graduate school professor when Atlanta University began its graduate school in 1929. He was the first professor. He was at University of Chicago. He was writing his dissertation on African American politics in Georgia. And this guy not only was one of the plaintiffs in the Primus King case in 1947 that outlawed the white primary, he was also a guy who in 1930 set up citizenship schools out of the Atlanta University. That is, people would go to 6 weeks, I think it was one time a week, and they'd get these certificates, and they were kind of encouraged. They learned about, voting and things of that nature. When he went back to finish his dissertation, he had a couple of other his colleagues at the university to take that over. He was the first African American to serve, I think, on the Fulton County Democratic Party Executive Committee. And sometimes I would be like a kid. I would go into his office, which was 2 doors down, because my office was in the social science building. You had political science and history and on the 3rd floor. And so I'd just go down and listen to him, like a kid, soaking up the knowledge. He not only knew it because of research, but he lived it. And that was another thing that actually got me interested in politics and in right. And he would do these analysis of election outcomes and things of that nature. But anyway, he was among those who was encouraging the Ford Foundation to put money into training and teaching and educating black people about their new civil rights. And so they needed an organization, and John was, one of the folks that, of course, helped to start. I think Vernon Jordan, was the first executive director, who later became executive director of the Urban League, and then a close buddy and confidant, of course, President Clinton, and an investment banker, senior law partner, and just did a lot of things, even to this day.
He was involved in the suit, the Holmes.
Oh, the
suit at the University of Georgia.
Yeah, he was someone who was something of a trailblazer as well in terms of just doing a lot of things, and many people thought he might run for an elective office, but I don't think Vernon was never interested in that. But I had a chance to talk to Mr. Hollowell, who was another idol. He was a guy who filed the suit, and he was, and also Horace Ward, Judge Ward. Most people don't know George Ward 10 years earlier tried to integrate the University of Georgia, but instead they bought him off, and he got his bachelor's degree in law at the University of Michigan, and I think a master's as well. And as you know, he became a federal district court judge and a church member of mine. We used to sit on the same pew, so I really got to know Horace.
You recall that in earlier days, that the state of Georgia would pay to send African American students to other law schools.
That's what Horace did. That's why I said that's how he got to
Johnson.
Leroy.
That. Yeah, Leroy Johnson.
He went to North Carolina Central University Law School, and where Maynard actually went to law school as well after it. Yeah, but no, I was well aware of that. As I said, see, remember, I was listening to Dr. Baycoat. Yeah. He taught me more. Second wisest person I knew, next to my grandma. I mean, he was just a great guy, and he practiced what he preached, and you can't ask more of that. But I just felt that one of the things that needed to happen, and one of the big surprises to me, was that Atlanta took so long to integrate their schools. Mm-hmm. When you mention that, because I actually integrated school, I left this out, in 1957 in Shepherdstown. It was myself, my cousin Elizabeth Ann, and 2 sisters, Molly and Charlotte Jenkins. And we integrated Shepherdstown High School. Now, we were the Shepherdstown 4, but there was a Little Rock 9, and they got all the PR, but there wasn't the same kind of thing. That, there weren't any massive demonstration, there wasn't a governor who blocked the school doors or anything like that. But it was the same year, same month, and everything. But, and I got thrown out of school a couple of times. Some of my badness came out in actions, and one thing, growing up in New York, you had to be, I guess, say, aggressive and not back down from folks, because then they'd be picking on you all the time. So that's why people joined gangs. Now, they didn't have any gangs in West Virginia, but the idea was I just felt, and I just reacted. One time the guy was, they were calling us names and everything, expletive deleted or whatever. But it wasn't a big thing. But one time, I guess, everyone reached a point, and the guy came up, and I didn't know who it was, grabbed him on my shoulder, my elbow went back to his stomach, he came down, I grabbed his head and ran him through the principal's door, the door was glass. And I got kicked out of school for a month, so my mom had to come down from New York and got back in school. And then we became friends, this guy and I. He was the fullback on the football team, and I was running back, played running back on the football team. And I played basketball as well and ran track, which is things I was more interested in high school than I was in academics. As I said, I grew up basically in college. I left off one mentor. I hate to be skipping around. There's a guy named Harry Klug. He's the guy who got me really rolling in terms of academics. Born in New York, left high school, went to the Navy, got married, had 2 kids, got out, got his PhD in 5 years from University of Iowa, and worked part-time in an ice cream factory to support his family. And he made it fun. He made learning fun. He really did. And there's another guy here, Jim Hafer. Jim quit high school. He was from Idaho, of all places. I never met another human being from Idaho. Big for his age, played jazz, joined the service, I think he was 16, got battlefield commissions, came out, went to college, went back to Korean War, came out lieutenant colonel, and went back to grad school. I mean, these guys were just unbelievable. Their experiences, all from really families, self-made and everything, and they made fun, learning fun and exciting, and they really got my, I guess, academic juices flowing, and they helped, you know, the scholarships and things that I got. One of the guys at Klug was in grad school with at Iowa, was chairman of American University's political science department, and I got an internship, you know, semester they called it, in Washington, D.C., so he got to know folk. In grad school, I was in this program that Columbia selected 50 of the graduate students from all over, med school, business school, arts and sciences, or whatever, and we basically, it was like a getting you interested in public affairs and international relations, and we had guest lectures like Henry Kissinger. We went down to Washington to meet the Majority Leader Mike Mansfield. We met Senator Fulbright. They tried to get us, we had met the Director of Research at the CIA, the United Nations Deputy Secretary General. I mean, we were supposed to be the so-called future leaders, and then 10 of us of the 50 were asked select to write essays on a foreign policy issue, and I was one of the lucky 10 for there. And so, I mean, those kind of experiences really did get my interest, you know, going in terms of public affairs, and I knew I would either teach or maybe get into public affairs in some other capacity, but those things all had a great influence on me. A couple of other issues. Several of the governors that I served under, all of them were unique. Senator Busbee had been a power, and I didn't really know him. I think he was chair of appropriations when he was elected, basically the same year that I was elected to the Georgia General Assembly. We did get along particularly well. Because like with the speaker, I guess my agenda was somewhat different from them. Not only in terms of wanting to see more African Americans appointed to, you know, important positions, judgeships, because I remember one time, I think it was like in 76 or 77, and I think the governor must have had like 2 or 3 appointments to the Supreme Court, a couple appointments to the Court of Appeals, a ton of Superior Court judges, and not one of them was an African American. I found that hard to believe. And that's the reason we didn't get along well. And, you know, I mean, things like that. And Maynard even brought that out in the campaign, you know, when he was talking about some things as he was coming out, and Joe Frank Harris, but Joe Frank did make a good start on that, as you probably know.
Can I digress
Sure.
for a minute? You
Sure.
mentioned Maynard. Maynard ran for the United States Senate.
68.
Were you here then?
No, I came here in 71.
Oh, that's right.
I came here in 71, but I talked to a lot of people about it, read a lot about it. I'll throw in a plug here. I just finished a book on Maynard Jackson. It will be published in October, in October, and I, you know, go into, of course, several of those things, and that's really how he got his start. And as Leroy Johnson said, it was a win-win situation. If he lost, you know, he would still have the envy and admiration of a lot of folks, and also perhaps encourage other folk to run for elective office. I mean, challenging this guy, they said, are you crazy? I mean, you drinking or smoking something that's illegal? You know, who can beat Talmadge? You know, he hadn't had a challenge the previous 2 elections. He didn't have any opposition. And so he said he had to do it, impressed by Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy, you know, who were assassinated a month apart. And that's why he said he did it. But his wife, whom I interviewed, of course, Bunny said he was out of his mind. You know, he said, here I am pregnant with a baby, and he doesn't have a job. He quits his job. He borrows the money to pay his filing fee. I mean, what are we going to live on? And luckily, her parents, you know, said they would pay their house note, you know, $157 a month, and that she would, you know, work up, and then her mom would come down. But it was just something that he did without even talking to her. But and Leroy Johnson was right. It was a win-win. And so the fact that he lost meant when he ran for vice mayor, there wasn't anyone who would even challenge him for that. I mean, the black community, the idea was he kind of deserved it. No one else even talked about running against Talmadge. And a couple folks started talking, but no, he had the field, you know, from the black community. And basically the same thing in '73 when he became mayor, because people thought that Leroy Johnson might be, because he had seniority, or even Horace, you know, Tate. But they thought maybe he should step aside because Horace had run for mayor and had lost. But surprisingly, when Horace had been a school board member, he got a large share of the white vote because they were elected at large as well. So he said, look, I've shown you I can get 22, 23% of the white vote, and that's all I need. Get elected. But they decided that the leadership, you know, the civil rights leadership, the Jesse Hills, Herman Russell, and some of the old folks who were involved in the voter registration back in the 40s, you know, the ministers, you know, Reverend Holmes Borders, I mean, you know, people like that who had been around, who had set up the Atlanta Negro Voters League and thing. They said, well, you know, people aren't ready to vote for a black mayor and a black vice mayor, so maybe you need to kind of step aside, and so you can't have both of you running. So Horace lost, you know, and Maynard, of course, you know, won in '73 because they thought he needed to take that extra step, you know, vice mayor and then mayor. But I think the civil rights leadership here really did play a great role in making Atlanta what it is, you know, today. And I think that Joe Frank Harris, in selecting Calvin Smyre as his floor leader, kind of made a symbolic gesture that I think showed them that at least their long, hard work in terms of election politics and voter registration was paying off. In other words, back to the Hartsfield thing in the 1940s, they had been the reason why Joe Frank was elected governor. No one had ever heard of Joe Frank Harris. I think he had like a 3% name recognition when he started out. 5. He was all the way up to 5%. Okay. And so, but the idea was that people like Calvin were out campaigning for him, and I admit I wasn't among those who was on the bandwagon initially, but it was something that I think boded well for the future in terms of showing that he was going to get African Americans involved in these significant, you know, kinds of positions. So I think that really helped a lot. And of course, Zell was a unique individual. It's almost like you had to choose between Zell and the Speaker. I mean, the Speaker was very close to Busbee and Harris. I mean, they were really his proteges. I mean, he had appointed them to their position. I mean, and that's how they made a lot of friends. But Joe Frank had probably the most effective campaign simply because 85% of the state house members were supporting him. I mean, you couldn't want an already organized, you know, campaign on the ground in practically every county in the state, and you didn't even have to pay a lot for it. They were using their people to be, you know, the foot soldiers, and that's why he won. I mean, basically, I mean, he didn't have to create a statewide campaign organization because he had one, because he had 125 legislators working for him, basically. And so, and I think that he did begin to make, greater strides in terms of appointments and things of that nature. Zell, had a reputation of being a maverick as well, and I liked him better when he was governor than I did in his post-governor political operation. But a lot of what he did and what the Speaker did was too personal. I hate to say it, but it wasn't quite as bad, although it was not too far away from the current situation with Lieutenant Governor Cagle and Speaker Richardson. I mean, they just personalize these things to the point, like they said, it's kind of like a street fight, almost. I mean, you ought to get rid of this guy. I mean, he's this and that. I mean, they're just personalizing things instead of dealing with public policy, which is always bad for the state. And I think, unfortunately, this last session was an indication of that, and the session before, was the same. I mean, the Speaker has this idea, which had good parts. You eliminate the license fee, birthday fee for the car, and you use some of the money for grading. You add a tag to it. Great source of fun. And then the Lieutenant Governor says, well, and no, he's never uttered a word, and then he says, well, since we're going to do this tax cut, why don't we just phase out the income tax? Just whack out another $1 billion+, And then he attaches it to the Speaker's bill. Now here we are at Grady Hospital trying to find a way to fund the trauma center, and they personalize it to the point that nothing gets done. And that's what I meant about bad. Somehow, some way, that never happened to the Speaker and the Governor, Miller. I mean, they would beat up on each other in the press and every place else, but eventually it would happen. It would happen. And so some people thought maybe they were going to go on a road show afterwards, the Zell and Speaker Murphy road show, because they said, well, it really wasn't perfect, but they did that because they had to show they were strong, they weren't going to back down, but eventually they compromised for the good of the state.
Let me go back to
Sure.
Governor Joe Frank Harris. He appointed, as I recall, the first African-American appellate court judge in history.
Yeah.
Judge Benham.
Yeah, Rob Benham. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, my frat brother. No, that's what I'm saying. I said the symbolic gesture of appointing Calvin as floor leader, in my mind, as I said, was saying, I'm going to show you that I'm going to be diverse in terms of my appointments and things of that nature. And Bob, of course, became the justice, first Supreme Court, Chief Justice, of Georgia. And as I said, but Zell, when he got in there, and obviously the lottery was his big thing and was his legacy. And I think that, if he didn't do anything else during the time that he was there, that made him an outstanding governor. Because there was a lot of things he did that I didn't go along with, like the 2 strikes and you're out. I mean, it's one thing to be tough, but it's another thing, I think, to go over the cliff, so to speak. And I think the problem we have today with the high number of folks who are in for these mandatory sentences and things of that nature, and not having any discretion from the judges was one of the worst things that ever happened. And of course, the other thing, and not nearly as bad, was with his implementation of the welfare reform thing, where he, unlike any other state, said, well, 5 years is too long. We need to cut it to 4 years where you're eligible. I mean, the money was there from the feds to do it for 5, but he did. So I think those are the 2 worst things, that he did. And as I said, it somewhat was balanced by the lottery to provide for the Hope Scholarships, to provide for the kindergarten, the pre-K thing, which is really a trailblazing kind of thing, and of course to buy, educational, equipment. I could talk a lot about some other things, but maybe I'll basically talk a little bit about my retirement. I guess the word that best describes the reason I did it was frustration. As I said, I was kicked off of the 3 committees that I had been on. Wasn't even allowed to serve on the committee. Had good legislation. I'd go to committees and people said, this is a good bill, and one of the guys mentioned he was directly affected by the bill. It would have been beneficial, but he couldn't vote for it because the leadership, was opposed to it. Appropriations, I know what it's like not to get stuff out because there's never enough, but even the little, what you call them, feds call them earmarks, we call them special projects. I didn't get a single special project, $25,000 for a center that was helping guys to get back with their families who were in drug addiction centers. And this little church over here had 12 beds, and we were able to get 25. We got another building. I said, we need some operational funds. Can you give me $25,000? No. So those are just indications of what I considered the...
Did you go before the green door?
Oh, no. They set up a special little group of 6 members who you would go to. These are little projects. No, green door, you go about big projects, multi-million-dollar. I'm talking about the special projects, which any person with any seniority can get $25,000, $30,000, or $50,000. You know, if you're there 4 to 6 years, maybe you get 25. You're at 8 to 10, you get 35, 40. 10 years, you get 50. Everyone got that. Republicans got it. I didn't get it, and I'm the senior person. Tied for couldn't even get $25,000 out of the budget. Never got a bill out of committee, even though people on the committee wanted it, but the leadership didn't get it. So I just said, I'm basically wasting my time here. There's some more important things that I could do, like working on a project called National Popular Vote. And what it is, it's a way to change the way the Electoral College casts its vote. You sign an interstate compact as a state, okay? When the states who sign its cumulative total of Electoral College votes is 270, which is a magic number to elect the president, then the compact takes effect. There are thousands of compacts that our states are involved with, from water distribution to everything you can imagine, educational compacts, whatever, and that's the way it operates. And so one of the things that I did at my policy center was to deal with what's called election law reform. As I said, that was my thing here, that's my thing there. We looked at things like alternatives to single-member election district method of voting. Most people aren't aware that it's only the former British colonies that use this method. Everyone else uses what's called some form of proportional representation. They use cumulative voting, they use preference voting. I won't go into details of those, but what it does, it makes it possible for different diverse groups within a society. If you look at all the European governments except Great Britain, as I said, they're the ones who like the single-member district. You have many parties, and under these systems, you can elect folks. In Africa, that's one of the things I did there. I was part of the United Nations election teams. There was a little country called Lesotho, which was landlocked along with Swaziland inside South Africa. Well, they had a king, and then they decided, well, they wanted to be like England in the sense of having the king as just a figurehead, but they would actually run like the parliament does in England. But they had 7 tribes. And to use a single-member electoral vote method, you know what happened? The largest tribe with about 26% of the people got 70% of the vote. Why? Because they got a plurality in just about every district. In other words, they only had 26%, but under the system where you win a plurality, more votes than anyone else, not necessarily a majority. The South is the only place that has runoffs, basically. That's the way most of these, some of them have a ceiling. They say, well, if you do that, you got to win at least 35% or 40% or whatever. So what you had was a nation that 26% of the people had 70% of the people in their parliament. They were going to have a civil war. And we went over there, basically, and we said, well, look, there is an alternative to this, and they decided on cumulative voting. So if you have multi-member districts, and of course, you have 26% of the population, the likelihood is if you have a 10-member, multi-member district, it's like electing at large by your county. Mm-hmm. You will have a good opportunity of getting about 1/4 of the votes. If you have 15%, you'll probably get, a couple of votes. So in other words, it gives everyone an opportunity to do that. Well, under our particular contract, the people in the states, and already have 5 of them we already got, but it's also passed in 7 other states, both houses. We're waiting on the governor to sign it and things of that nature, and we hope to do this by 2011. And because I was working on this, one of the guys who used to be president of the scientific games, who helped to develop the scratch-off lottery tickets, and he got a few dollars from
Dan Bauer.
No, this is a guy named Dr. John Kosa.
Yeah.
He's head of scientific gain. He lives in California now, teaches some course in computer genetic engineering. He's off the chart in terms of IQ. But anyway, so John said 2000 was awful and 2004 was almost awful, because if Kerry had won in Ohio, Bush would have had over 3 million more votes, but he would have been the president, just like Bush won before. And then he looked back and he said that, you know, a change of less than 1% in 2 or 3 states in the last 12 elections would have produced 5 presidents who would have received fewer votes than the person they would have defeated. So he says, we got to do something about it. It's going to cost money, John. We got to lobby individual states to do it. He said, well, we'll start off. So he hired lobbyists in 16 states. First thing out of the suit, money is how much you need. So basically, there's 6 of us that are kind of coordinating that, and we work with the lobbyists in the different states. You know, I've been in North Carolina, I've been in Connecticut, I've been in New York and Maryland, you know, where I know a lot of folks, a lot of legislators and things, and having served on a lot of positions with black elected officials, like the Georgia Association of Black Elected Officials, the National Black Caucus of State Legislatures, you know, being on the executive committee over 20 years, you get to know just about everyone in there. And of course, and serving also on committees, the National Conference of State Legislatures. I've been on a bunch of task force. We had 15 members on the No Child Left Behind task force. I was one of those members. We had hearings in New York, in Portland, Oregon, Chicago, so anywhere. So that was because I had worked on, you know, the alternative election system, because I had known a lot of folks. My name came to John's attention, and so they called me and asked me. I said, I think it's great. And I had been kicking around these different ideas, because the Electoral College is an anachronism. It's 225 years old, and it was a result of political compromise, just like having the senators, you know, 2 from each state. Wyoming with 500,000 has the same number as California with 40 million people. It's insane to have that.
Let's talk a minute about.
Sure.
Bob, let's change tape.
Okay. And so, you know, that was an opportunity that was out there to deal with the national popular vote. And as I said, we're optimistic that it will happen. Right now, we have 23% of the states whose electoral college votes total, you know, 57 now. You need 270. That's the magic number. And we are confident that there are several states that the time ran out on us last time, like Georgia. You know, there are only about 10 states where they stay in year-round. So you got to get them early. And so we just got Nevada, we just got Washington State, we got Rhode Island, we got Massachusetts, we got Maine, we got Vermont. And these folks are on the sort of on the list, the hot list, that we want to try to get them before they adjourn, and then we can go back to New York and a few other places. We're probably going to have to wait, because Arnold vetoed it the first time it passed out there. It said it passed in other states. But we've got about 9 states that we think we'll get this year, and then that'll give us 2 more years to get what we think will be the other half. But we've been working on them. Matter of fact, even little states like Delaware and Connecticut, because every state counts. And that's what it'll do. It'll make sure that every vote counts equally, because they will agree and sign the interstate compact to cast their vote for the candidate who receives the most national popular votes cast in the country in the 50 states and the District of Columbia. So every vote will be equal. You won't have a situation like Wyoming, you know, whose people's votes count 8 times as much as that of the Californians. I mean, it doesn't make sense. And it's the only office in the world where you can win and get fewer votes than the person you beat. The only one in the entire world. Okay? So we need to and 70%, polls have been taken, 70% of the people in the country favor more of a national popular vote way of doing it than the Electoral College. Another opportunity, I actually do a little bit of still, I guess I'd call it coaching a young man, for example, since I did a lot of work in Nigeria over 15 years with their state legislatures and met people. And a few years ago, I was doing some work on setting up a research and budget office for them, just like our congressional budget office that was set up in 1974, because they'd put 4 billion naira in to build, you know, 300 elementary schools, and at the end there'd be 100 elementary schools and the 4 billion naira were gone, or to build 100 kilometers of interstate roads and $2 billion, and $2 billion be gone, they've only built 50 kilometers. And you know, that's what the U.S. Congress was in. They had no way of tracking, monitoring, and oversight. They didn't have any staff or anything to do it. So I figured this will save, particularly in education. That's where it goes back to that, if these schools could have been built, then that country is going to, do it. And it's just a corrupt situation. But anyways, the result of knowing it, a new speaker was elected last year, and he appointed a young man who was very bright. He's chief of staff, former Navy commander, has a law degree, an engineering degree, but had never been involved in the political process. So I kind of served as his executive coach, teaching him the nuts and bolts. I actually brought him down here to Georgia, took him up to D.C., spoke to speak to staffs, former speakers and things of that nature. Good friend Newt, his chief of staff. So he really knows what the job entails. Even had him talk to several of the people here because I said, look, it's Nigeria, but these are the same kind of things. Steve Anthony was just a great. And Steve was Speaker Murphy's, and Steve and I had a great relationship. So Steve spoke to him and things like that. And then I'm writing stuff as well, and have a couple of other offers to write books. The one I just finished on Maynard Jackson. So these are things I've been putting off in large part because of the legislature, and these are things now that I can spend my time on and be happy because I can see things happen. I mean, we send emails around and people celebrate that we have 28 houses or Senate in the states in the country who have passed the version of national popular vote. Like in North Carolina, we passed it in the Senate, so now we got to get the House. And that kind of thing. We passed it, House in Arkansas, now we got to get the Senate. And we got a couple years. Well, no, some of them, when they're 4 years, it's good because it carries over. But when you have an election in between, you start from scratch. So that's why we have to prioritize states. And it can be hectic, but it's fun, and you can instantly see the results of it. There was an issue that you wanted, I talked about my interest in electoral college, electoral voting reforms and things of that nature. And as I said, I consider that to be my so-called area of expertise, and I've also been an expert witness in a number of voting rights cases, federal district courts here, Tennessee, other places. I also done work for the Southern Poverty Law Center, basically going around the South and identifying areas or potential court cases, that they should file and things like that dealing with voting rights. But I think that one of the things that I see as a great change for the better is the use of different means of getting the vote out. I think, we're one of the worst countries in the world, and Georgia is one of the worst states in the United States in terms of electoral turnout. And as I said, that's why I was so interested in the motor voter legislation that I first introduced, and then when the feds passed it, then it made life easier here to get it to pass it out, but to implement it here in Georgia. And I think that has helped a lot about getting people on the rolls. I think that we need to look at how we can make it easier for folks rather than that one day on a work day to do it. And I think we've made a great deal of progress there. We have early voting, and as you probably know, at the last election for the president, I think about roughly 30% of the folks had already voted before the election. So you still had long lines because it was a record turnout, in terms of that. But I think that electronic voting, which is something that states like Oregon have been pioneers in, I think we need to, of course, look at that. I mean, anything that will make it easier for folks to vote is something that I generally favor. Now, you got to have controls, because wherever there's something like that, there's potential for fraud. But I believe that we use the models, we use examples of folks who've been doing this for years. They've gotten out just about most of the bugs, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And the equipment that can be made, it's just like using the touch screen voting machine. I mean, I think that makes life easier. So I think these kinds of reforms are things that that are great. And I think that now that we have years of experience and operations of these systems in other states, that Georgia needs to come into the 20th century and see, it's cost benefit. What is the best way to get rid of all of these paper ballots and hanging chads and things of that nature, so you won't have, and I do believe in the paper trail as well. And we didn't do it here initially, and a lot of folks were upset about it because it's just a matter of enhancing people's sense of comfort with any new development. Because they're saying, like, with use of computers, hey, garbage in, garbage out. You can program something to do something that doesn't reflect what the actual situation was. And so I think it's a very low price to pay to have the paper trail where people can actually check and therefore verify that their votes were in fact cast for the candidates that they wanted to.
Do you think that voter identification requirement is a deterrent to voting?
It is for a relatively small number of people. I think senior people, but it's kind of weird to think that in places where, and that goes back to my hometown of Shepherdstown, where everyone knows everybody, and someone's been on the rolls for 40 years. And this young lady, like my grandmom, she's never had a driver's license, it's just an inconvenience that is unnecessary since everyone knows. Why should this lady have to go to the polls and produce a card? My mom never even got a driver's license. But in other words, if there is a problem that has been identified, then you take actions to, in fact, solve it. There was no evidence presented about anything. The biggest form of voter fraud in Georgia is absentee balloting. And I've said for years, and I've tried to do something about that, even when I was chairman of the committee, and these folks who are pushing the IDs, I have not heard them say one word about that. There are dozens of cases of prosecutions, hundreds of cases of prosecution for that, but they haven't done anything about it. Why is it? Now, some people say it's just absolute politics, that absentee ballots are primarily used by Republicans, quote unquote, so you don't want to deal with it. And the folks who are adversely impacted the most by voter identification are likely to be Democrats. And they say that's the answer as to why they're going after this so-called reform. But it's like a solution in search of a problem, because I don't remember anyone coming to my committee that I chaired for a decade dealing with voter reform, and we would get reports after every election. We would say, Secretary of State, please tell us about election fraud problems and give us some legislation, model legislation, whatever, of how we can resolve it. I had never gotten one complaint from the Elections Board, Secretary of State's office is saying, we got this horrible problem dealing with fraud involving voter ID. So that's the reason that I never had a bill in my committee, because there was never any proof. And my idea is that the legislature, that's what they're supposed to do. Now, sometimes you want to get ahead of the curve and anticipate problems, but if you have this massive problem that's out there, it seems to me that someone, even Republicans, no Republican ever came in and told me, we need voter ID because down in my district, our registrar says that there are, 5% of the people are using fraud to vote, to get their ballots. And so that's what I'm saying. It's a solution in search of a problem. I don't think it's necessary. But I think if you do have a problem that has been clearly identified, like absentee balloting, you deal with that first and foremost. But we haven't even, no one even talks about that now. Yep.
Let's get back to Bob Holmes.
Okay. Well, life after the General Assembly, I guess. We have basically, the wife and I have done a lot of traveling. We've been fortunate. We've been blessed. We were in China last year. We were in South Africa the year before, and Brazil, Costa Rica, Nicaragua. I'm taking her some of these places where I went to do work, like South Africa. I won't take her to Nigeria. It's too dangerous. But we're trying to get around to 2 or 3 places every year. We've got 8 grandkids. From college to elementary school, and we spend a lot of time with them. We bring them down during the summer, or we're blessed to have some timeshare, so we take them with us on vacations down to Florida, Disney World, or we go to different things with them. Like one of my grandsons is a high school choir director, and when he's doing stuff, like he was in San Francisco, we went out there and spent a little time with him, and his choir won first prize in their division, and so we kind of relax, and I do my running. I just got off the board of the Road Runners Clubs of America, where I'd been on for 4 years. We had about 900 clubs who are members and about 250,000 members. I do a lot of volunteer civic work. I'm on the board of the Grady Hospital. I'm on the board of the Sickle Cell Foundation of Georgia. I'm on the Metropolitan Atlanta Advisory Board. I used to be on the full board. I'm on a little foundation of the little college in my town, Shepherd University. I'm on the foundation board there trying to raise money. I'm on my church's finance committee and on the Commission on Higher Education, and do a few other things that keep me busy. I'm going to do another triathlon next month. I run probably 1 or 2 road races a month, and this will be my 3rd triathlon I'll be doing in June. So I try to keep busy, try to keep healthy. As my grandchildren, the younger, the babies, always talk about how old I am. I'll be 66, but I still, my physician primary says I probably have a 35-year-old body. Blood pressure is.
Tell me that.
Yeah.
So you hadn't got time for much golf?
I've never played a round of golf in my life.
Or fishing, or hunting?
My brother does both. My brother, 2 years older than I am, he plays golf 3 days a week. He goes deep sea fishing around the Gulf. He'll start, in Mobile, and then the next month, at least once a month, they'll go around Panama City, always. That's what he does. And I've never gotten interested in that. I do try to do at least 1.5 to 2 hours of exercise, physical fitness a day. It'll be running, it'll be swimming, it'll be biking, it'll do Nautilus equipment and things of that nature.
Gosh, you're making me sick.
No. Jack LaLanne is my idol. He's 95.
Yeah.
For his 80th birthday, he put a harness on his back and he swam a mile pulling a tugboat. For his 90th birthday, he swam 32 miles from the coast of California to Catalina Island. I'm waiting for what he's going to do his 100th birthday. He's my idol. He's my idol.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap it up, Bob. I want to ask you a couple of questions, personal questions. First of all, if you had your political career to do over, would you have done anything differently?
I don't think anything significantly different. I like to think, as I said, in following the teachings and upbringing of my grandmom, I'd like to think that at least I tried to do what was right in every circumstance, regardless. And it was clear in some instances that it would have been politically beneficial for me to have done the other things. Like I said, I could have come in to the legislature and, like the usual freshman, say absolutely nothing, just listen and get along. And one of my best friends would probably be a model for that. That's Calvin Smyre. I may have been a governor's assistant floor leader. I may have been a committee chairman long before I was a committee chairman. I'm pretty sure I would have had I taken that route. But, like the Bible says, if you teach them certain things when they're young, when they're old, they won't depart of it. And I couldn't even consider doing some of the kinds of things that would have probably been more beneficial to my political career. And I always wanted to be in a situation whereby I never wanted something bad enough that I would forget my grandmom's teachings in order to get it. Mm-hmm. And I've been blessed, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, how many folks who came from my background have been lucky enough or blessed enough to do the things I've done, founding 2 banks. We were going to open up the Regional Bank of Middle Georgia before this recession, occurred. I mean, that would have been a 3rd bank. I mean, most people don't found a single bank. And, and the things like the work on the national popular vote, which is directly connected, or the things with the voter registration, because a lot of folk didn't like that. And one of my favorite articles was actually it was a play on John Kennedy's profile in courage. And one of the editorial writers for the Constitution wrote this article, and she said it about the state legislature. And I was one of the 10 people that she mentioned. So I'd like to think that that's proof of what I tried to do was right.
So you never thought of running for another political office?
Only one time. I had thought that maybe I would run for the Congress. But John Lewis is one of my best friends. We lived 4 blocks apart. And he's been in that position, and I would never even think about running against him. But that was a fleeting moment that I said it was the only office I would be interested in other than being in the legislature, another legislative office. And I just felt that he's doing a good job, and I would never run just because I want to run because of my own personal ambitions. And if he weren't doing a good job, then I would probably say, I think I can do a better job, and therefore I'm going to run. But
how would you like to be remembered?
Well, basically, pretty much what I said, someone who did what he thought was right, someone who did things that were for the benefit of people, other than his own personal gratification or own financial gain, things of that nature, and that the legislation that I passed and the policies that I supported were things that were for the betterment of the people, and not necessarily folk, in my district. Most of the 34 years that I served was from a district that was upper middle class. I'm not saying this, but for example, the new subdivision that was developed in my neighborhood, right in my community, 300 yards from where I live, the houses start at $800,000. The Cascade Heights, the houses start at $400,000. That first one now, the house at Audubon, starts at $1 million. That these weren't the people who needed the legislation. In education, these people could send their kids to private school if they wanted to. It was for what I thought, just like being on the board of Grady Hospital. These people, I don't have any public housing in my district. I've never had public housing in my district. And the people have their health insurance. But I have a lot of people, relatives and things, not here, but in West Virginia, in New York. I lived in Harlem for a while. I went to public hospital when I broke my wrist playing, basketball and things of that nature. And I know that there are things. My mom was a hotel maid, and a lot of the friends that I grew up with there, their parents they worked, but they made minimum wages. And so I know that there are people out there, and my grandmom again says, the Lord bless you so you can be a blessing to others. And Luke 12:48, to whom much is given, much is expected. And I'd like to think that I lived my political life and made political decisions based on those types of philosophies.
Yeah. Well, Bob, I want to thank you on behalf of Young Harris College, the Richard B. Russell Library, and the University of Georgia for being our guest today.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it, and hope you have many more exciting interviews that are more exciting than mine when you talk to others